Good morning, A-Pushers. We are here in time period 8B in the 1960s and early 70s here. Purpose of this video is going to take a look at the expansion of the civil rights movement, topic 8.11. And this is kind of taking the civil rights movement beyond that of African Americans and, well, expanding this to look at other groups that are protesting for similar rights and recognition. Let's get to it. So the inset slide that I've got in here is from the kind of the peak of accomplishment for the African American civil rights movement, where has been a push not only for recognition of equal protection of the law with the 24th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act, but also a protection of voting rights with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The focus that we've had and that historians kind of take on African American rights is because that is such a long-term development through the course of American history. But when you look at modern America, there's definitely more to the country than just white and black Americans. So during this time period, starting in the late 60s, there are other population groups that are continuing to demand. And this is kind of like where the phrasing on this, none of these are like really new demands for the 1960s. This is just kind of where it fits into this puzzle, and there's more, I guess, recognition that comes out from this time period, either through government action or through social recognition in a lot of ways. And we can definitely talk more about that when we get into the 70s and 80s and beyond. But for the demands they're making, social and economic equality, very similar to what we saw in the African American movement, and then a redress of past injustices. Past injustices are going to be a little bit different so far as the different population groups are concerned, but there is definitely a an offshoot, so to speak, of the African American movement in this case. So we've got like four different groups that we're going to take a look at as we're walking through this. One kind of is like the original you know, past injustices that show up in the class is American Indians. So in 1969, there is the formation of the American Indian Movement. This is a protest organization designed to not only point out the inequality in modern society, but again, to try to point out the injustices that the U.S. government has run over the course of generations and generations through this. In 1972, they published this document called the Trail of Broken Treaties, and this document is really, I mean, it's kind of like Helen Hunt back in 1881, so like almost 90 years earlier, over 100 years. I guess it is like, what, 91 years earlier. Sorry with my math problems there. But the Trail of Broken Treaties is kind of like spelling out all of the treaties that the U.S. government has signed with Native American groups and broken with Native American groups. And among the demands that are coming out in this in the 60s and 70s, they want a new emphasis placed on negotiation of treaties. They feel like that even though they are within the United States, American Indians have a sovereign status, and there should be more direct communication between Native American groups and the US government. And there's like varying levels of success on this. And so there's sit-in protest. And this is the picture here is them camping out in front of the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. They actually conduct a sit-in protest at the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. At different points in time in the late 60s and early 70s, they conduct sit-in protests and take over some national monument or national park lands. 1969 in Alcatraz, the little island prison in San Francisco Bay, they take it over. Wounded Knee, South Dakota, they kind of block it off and take it over, even though it was kind of protected federal government land. While there's not a lot of direct success that comes initially from the AIM, they are still relevant in today's society. They are involved with the protests and the movement that's happened on some of the sports teams that have changed their names. The Cleveland Indians to the Cleveland Guardians, and the Washington Redskins to the Washington football team, and now the Washington Commodores. The reason for those calls for change is because it seems to they felt it was a derogatory depiction of their culture and their heritage. And whether you agree with that or not, there is a level of change that has happened as a result to it, and it makes them worth a moment of study here. There's also Asian American movements that are taking place. And this is one that, to be honest, I don't have a whole lot of background with because it's not something that's really been emphasized in this part of the country, much more so in California. I mean, the Asian American movements, if you think about it, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act back in 1882, and then there was the internment camps for Japanese Americans during World War II, and there have been discriminatory hiring practices, but this has been largely on the West Coast. Well, the West Coast has also been the center of other protests, whether it's the Students for a Democratic Society, kind of getting their origins in University of California at Berkeley, or if it is the Black Panther movement starting in Oakland, there is a connection to be had here. So in 1968, there is the formation of the Asian American Political Alliance, which is a political organization, but it's a fairly militant political organization. And there was an overlap of their membership with the AAPA and the Black Panthers. The man in the picture here is at a Black Panther rally. His name is Richard Aoki, and he is a central figure in the 1960s AAPA. As an organization, the AAPA is going to dissolve itself in the early 1970s, but there is definitely more attention being paid to Asian American groups in the time since then. And if you think about it, you can probably imagine a couple of instances where this has become kind of a hot button issue here in the early 2020s. Having more of an impact a little bit closer to where we are in Texas and in different parts of the country as well is the movement for Latino rights. One of the origin cases on this goes to the Supreme Court in 1954. Peter Hernandez was a Mexican American farm worker working along the Texas coast down closer to Victoria and Corpus Christi and that area. He was arrested and ultimately convicted for murder in the early 1950s. It was 1952 is when the alleged crime happened, and he ended up appealing this decision because he and his lawyers argued that he was discriminated against because there were no Mexican Americans that were involved in the jury. So he was convicted by an all-white jury. So this sounds a little bit like some of the African American issues that we have seen. As a matter of fact, in Texas in the 1950s, at least in Jackson County, Texas, Mexican Americans were completely excluded from the jury pool process. And so as this gets to the Supreme Court rules in favor of Hernandez and overturns this murder conviction as a result of this discriminatory practice in jury selection. So big picture on this recognizes the rights of Mexican Americans, and it says in there other population groups. And so the key on this is going to be, this is the first case that it really takes the idea of civil rights and equality among races and kind of moves it beyond a white-black issue. And I know that I kind of jumped the timeline a little bit because we were talking in the late 60s and early 70s, and this is going back to the 1950s, but this is kind of a semi-crucial case. It's a folder-worthy case, if you know what I'm saying with that. By the time you get into the 1960s, the thing to keep in mind is, like, in the 50s and 60s and even beforehand, the majority of Latino workers, Mexican American workers, and other Central and South Americans that have immigrated to the United States, they are by and large working in the agricultural economy. They're farm workers. And so by the 1960s, there is a movement to unionize the farm workers. And so as they kind of create the United Farm Workers Union, they are working to protect farm worker rights, but there's a real focus on the Mexican American farm workers. That's the predominant immigrant group, ethnic group that's involved with this. Si se puede basically means yes, we can, and this is the idea they're going to be able to unionize and to protect their rights not just as workers, but also as Latino Americans. Two central figures involved with this going to be Cesar Chavez. Chavez was one of the original organizers for the United Farm Workers, and in the 1970s he helps organize a boycott of California grapes, where trying to encourage a boycott nationwide on this, and with success, because the goal was to get farm workers, at least in the grape sector of the agriculture economy, to get them better pay and get them more of a living wage. Kind of working in tandem with Chavez is Dolores Huerta. Both of these names are names that you are going to you probably want to keep track of because they are testable. But Chavez and Huerta are both working within the United Farm Workers. Chavez passed away in the 1970s, but Huerta is still alive, and I have been lucky enough to hear her speak as she has come to University of Houston a couple times in the last several years. Talking about the need to protect not just immigrant rights and Latino rights, but worker rights as well. In 1970, so far as political parties are concerned, La Raza Unida party is established. Raza Unida is basically the united race. The idea behind this is that they want to expand the conversation of Latino rights to go beyond Mexican American and make sure that it's clear that this is like a large number of nationality groups that are included with this. And so it is a regional political party, which is why on the flag here it's really focusing on the Southwest. But one of the real successes they see in the 1970s is the establishment and the development of ESL programs in public schools. Prior to the 1970s, all public schools were required to be taught in English, and if English was not your first language, you had very, very limited opportunities to be able to attend and be successful. Through their work in the 1970s, most states in the country at this in 2023, by now, most states have some level of bilingual education programs that are in place. And so this is a real success that comes out of this movement that has its origins in the 1960s and 70s. In addition to various ethnic groups that are demanding equality and protection of their rights, feminist and gay and lesbian activism is increasing here in the 60s and 70s as well, because they are mobilizing behind their claims for legal, economic, and social equality. This kind of cuts across all ethnic lines, and so it is a different kind of category that comes into play here. For women's rights, there's nothing really new about the women's rights movement going through U.S. history. We've talked about it going back to the days of the American Revolution. But here in the 1960s, the change has got to do with just it kind of happens along with the calls for greater rights from these different groups. And then kind of urging this along is Betty Friedan's book called The Feminine Mystique in 1963. And then she is going to help organize the National Organization for Women that's established in 1966. The Feminine Mystique, Friedan is a psychologist, and she is a psychologist that was a working woman during World War II, and then kind of felt unsatisfied in regards to her life as she was expected by mainstream social norms to return home and become a housewife in the late 1940s going to the 1950s. And so she continues education and she gets a psychology, she focuses on psychology and she writes this book. And the focus of this book is really about like the demand that the need that women have to be treated more as an equal in society, that they are in some cases really being disregarded, and this is something that can do like psychological damage to people. And there is, I mean, in terms of like economic equality and social equality, there are limited opportunities for women in the workforce, and that's going to be some slow changing going on in the 1960s, but changes are going to happen. The National Organization for Women is focused on expanding women's rights, and this is going to get into like issues of healthcare and issues of birth control and things that are actually going to kind of be partially about civil rights, specifically into civil rights, political and social rights, but also getting into social norms and social standards in terms of the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And that's actually going to show up in topic 812 for us instead. So a little bit of an overlap here with feminism and women's rights, the women's rights movement. The same can be said for the gay rights movement. The gay rights movement is definitely, kind of getting, it's getting more attention. It's being the idea of being gay is more openly discussed in the 1960s, because in generations beforehand that was seen as being way too far outside of a social norm, and it was completely judged by society as having like the level of immorality to it. But starting with the Stonewall riots in 1969, this is in New York. A gay club is raided by police, and as there are um, some news reporters on hand to cover it, this leads to a series of protests in areas of New York and gets wide recognition around the country for this, and raising questions about the rights of these people involved in this movement. And historians, by and large, regard this as being the origins of the gay rights movement here in 1969. Would not have happened this way if not for the other civil rights movement that have been going on through the entire decade. But knowing that this is still something that is a kind of a hot button social political topic in the 21st century, it is important to kind of point out where these debates kind of have their origins, and this is definitely a spot on that. So as you can see, we're really kind of moving beyond just a white black issue in the United States, and we're talking about like equality for various groups of people as the nation starts to recognize the diversity of its population that has been there for generations. But it's really not until the 60s and 70s that that recognition gets to be seen and recognized more formally by a broader group of Americans.